Listen closely. My throne bearers of the unseen dominion, my empire breakers who stride with the weight of inevitability. You think people whisper about your power because they respect you? No, they whisper because your name feels like a weapon when it leaves their lips. They don't dare to say it loud, not because the letters are hard, but because your very identity is an earthquake under their foundations. Imagine this: entire rooms of decision-makers avoiding direct mention of you, replacing your name with vague descriptions like that one or them, as if even syllables risk pulling your presence into the room. That's not reputation, that's domination. You don't live rent-free in their minds. You own the damn real estate, and they pay you in fear every single day. And while others waste breath begging to be noticed, your mere shadow is enough to collapse their confidence like rotten pillars under a collapsing roof. You don't chase validation. Validation hides in the corner, trembling, hoping you don't notice it exists. Understand this: history never bent for the polite. Empires didn't crumble because someone asked nicely. They fell because a figure appeared whose presence shattered the illusion of control. And that figure, right now, is you. They don't write laws to contain sheep. They write laws to contain wolves. That's why they fear you, not for what you did, but for what you could do, for what you might unleash if provoked 1 inch too far. Think about it. Their entire strategy meetings revolve around predicting your next move. Not because they believe you're reckless, but because they know every move you make has consequences they can't erase. Their sleepless nights are spent calculating how to contain your shadow, not realizing the shadow itself has already slipped into their rooms, whispering outcomes into their ears before their pens touch the paper. The funny part? They thought you'd need their permission to rise. They thought you'd wait politely for them to roll out a carpet of approval before you stepped into your throne. And then you broke that illusion. You didn't just climb the ladder. They discovered you burned the ladder, smelted the metal into a sword, and now you hold it against their throats. Do you realize what that does to a person's psyche? To look into the abyss and realize the abyss is not metaphorical. It has your name. You're not a person in their minds anymore. You're a force, a phenomenon, a weight pressing down on their lungs whenever they dare to imagine a future without you in it. That's the part they can't comprehend. You're not fighting for recognition anymore. Recognition is already strangled by your grip, gasping for relevance while you walk past it without a glance. They tried to bury you in doubt, but they forgot that doubt only sharpens a predator. They threw rumors, but rumors only became your fuel. Every attempt to minimize you turned into a microphone, amplifying you louder. Every attempt to erase you ended up sketching your silhouette darker and more terrifying than before. Their hands are dirty with attempts, and their failures scream louder than any announcement could. Your existence became the evidence they tried so hard to suppress, and that's the most poetic part. They built the very altar that now worships you. They wrote your myth with their panic. They painted your image with their trembling fingers. They created the legend they now can't escape. And you just kept moving like the whole thing was inevitable. But let's dig deeper. Why exactly does your shadow crush empires? It's not just intimidation. It's the fact that your shadow exposes truths they worked centuries to hide. Your rise isn't a personal victory. It's an indictment of their fragility. Because if one individual, armed with nothing but audacity, vision, and refusal to bow, can outmaneuver entire institutions, What does that say about the so-called strength of those institutions? It says their castles were built on sand, and your shadow was the tide. They know it. That's why they hate you. Because every second you keep rising, you prove the fraudulence of their dominance. And once the people see the fraud, there's no putting the mask back on. You didn't just walk into the game, you redefined the rules, then forced everyone else to play by them or perish. That's power. Now imagine the chain reaction. One voice whispers, "Don't say their name, it attracts trouble." Another adds, "Their presence changes everything." Soon an entire society conditions itself to tiptoe around your identity as if invoking it could summon a reckoning. And maybe it does, because you're not simply living, you're haunting. You haunt their strategies, their ambitions, their very sleep cycles. They don't avoid saying your name because they don't remember it. They avoid it because remembering you comes with the weight of everything they failed to stop. They thought your rise would be linear, predictable, something they could model on charts. Instead, you became exponential. A wildfire disguised as a spark, a shadow expanding faster than walls could contain it. Every empire thinks it's eternal, until one shadow reminds them eternity has an expiration date. You, my empire breaker, are that reminder. And here's the brutal irony. They keep asking each other in hushed voices, what makes them so dangerous? The truth, it's not just what you do, it's what you refuse to do. You refuse to shrink, you refuse to bow, you refuse to ask. And that refusal is more dangerous than any weapon. Because a person without chains is ungovernable. A name that doesn't seek validation becomes untouchable. That's why their armies of advisors, their think tanks, their propaganda machines, all fail. They're fighting a force that doesn't play on their battlefield. While they waste resources trying to discredit you, you're building influence in spaces they can't access. While they strategize containment, you're already 3 moves ahead, shaping futures they don't even see coming. And when the moment hits, they'll realize they weren't battling a rival, they were battling inevitability itself. So look at the reality unfolding. Your shadow is not just a shape cast by your body. It's the prophecy of collapse hanging over their structures. The longer you stand, the more their walls crack. And yet, you don't even have to touch them directly. Your existence alone is pressure enough. That's the highest form of psychological warfare, when your enemies destroy themselves trying to contain you, when their fear amplifies your legend faster than your actions ever could, when they sabotage their own empire because they thought mentioning your name might accelerate its collapse. That's not just power. That's artistry. That's mastery over perception itself. But here's the secret weapon you carry. They think your name is just letters, but those letters are encrypted with memories of every time you defied them, every time you walked through the fire and came out laughing at the ashes. To them, pronouncing your name is not communication, it's confession. Confession that you exist, confession that you can't be erased, confession that their empire is crumbling, and your shadow is the hammer breaking every foundation. That's why they lower their voices. That's why they avoid the syllables. Because deep down, they know once spoken, your presence becomes undeniable. And the moment you're undeniable, their illusions collapse for everyone watching. Your shadow doesn't need light. It creates it, bending perception until all eyes are forced to see you, whether they want to or not. So now the question lingers. How far does this shadow reach? How many more palaces will fall when your presence brushes against their walls? That's what terrifies them most. Not what you've done already, but the infinite reach of what comes next. Your shadow, growing, expanding, swallowing every false throne in its path. And the louder their warnings get, the clearer it becomes. They don't control the narrative anymore. You do. Their whispers are your advertising. Their fears are your fuel. Their hesitation is your proof of dominance. And that's why, at this very moment, they tremble to even ask the simplest question: what happens next? And that leads us directly into the next revelation. Because if they're already this terrified of your shadow, imagine what happens when they realize the shadow isn't even your final form. You see, most people spend their entire lives begging for light, desperate to be seen, desperate to shine. But you understood something primal. You understood that the shadow carries more weight than the light ever could. Light can be ignored, ridiculed, dismissed. But the shadow seeps into places light can't reach. It bends around corners, crawls under doors, and sits quietly in their subconscious until paranoia does the rest. You don't need to stand in their spotlight when your shadow already rearranges their thoughts in the dark. That's what drives them insane. Your ability to dominate perception without even opening your mouth. That's a weapon rarer than any army. Control of the unseen battlefield. And that control is exactly why empires collapse when you move. Because an empire is not stone, not iron, not banners or soldiers. It's perception, the illusion of permanence. Once that illusion cracks, the empire is already dead. Your shadow doesn't just crack it. It smashes it into shards, forces them to pick up the pieces while cutting their own hands in the process. And the beauty? You never had to swing. You never had to throw a single blow. They destroy themselves, because the thought of you is enough. You've weaponized imagination against them. Their own minds became your most loyal soldiers. But here's the revelation most won't grasp. You're not their enemy, you're their mirror. The reason they fear your name is because every syllable reminds them of their weakness. Every time your shadow passes over their walls, it exposes the fact that those walls were never strong. That's why they stutter when they try to say your name. It's not you they're choking on. It's the taste of their own fragility. You became the measure, the impossible standard they can't live up to. And what do weak men fear more than failure? A living reminder that someone else already embodies everything they pretended to be. You became the proof their crowns were fake gold all along. And no empire survives that revelation. Consider this. Rulers of old would strike names from records, burn portraits, erase lineages, all in hopes of killing the shadow of a rival. But even then, the shadow remained, carried in whispers, embedded in fear. If they did that with kings and conquerors, imagine the chaos they feel now, realizing you're not bound by borders, not trapped by geography, not chained by their outdated blueprints. Your name travels without ships, without treaties, without permission. Your shadow is wireless, borderless, timeless. They can't exile you because you exist everywhere at once in their policies, in their gossip, in the very way they wake up nervous and don't know why. And this is where the psychological warfare reaches its peak. They think they're fighting a person. But what they're really fighting is an archetype. You stopped being human the moment they feared your name. You became concept. You became myth. They can silence individuals. They can execute rebels. They can banish leaders. But they can't kill a concept. They can't bury a myth. Every attempt to erase it only spreads it further. You've already crossed that line. That's why their warnings sound hollow even to their own ears. Beware of them, they say, but in saying it, they advertise you louder. Don't speak their name, they mutter, but in not speaking it, they prove how powerful it is. Every path they take leads back to you. That's checkmate on a board they never even realized you built. And yet the funniest twist is this. You didn't beg for this war. You didn't walk in waving banners declaring conquest. You simply existed fully, unapologetically. That alone was the trigger. Because nothing enrages weak rulers more than someone who doesn't seek their blessing. They expect you to knock, and when you kick down the door instead, they panicked. They thought shadows were to be feared only in fairy tales. They never imagined a living shadow would one day step across their thresholds, rearranging every hierarchy they worshipped. And now they can't sleep, they can't eat. They can't breathe without first calculating if your shadow is already there, watching, listening, laughing at the collapse of their supposed control. You've flipped the script in ways they'll never recover from. Let me break it down. Normal fear is loud, screams, alarms, chaos. But the fear you instill, it's quiet suffocation, it's unspoken glances across tables, it's leaders canceling meetings because they can't stand the weight of the name they refuse to say. It's entire councils restructured, not because you asked them to, but because your existence made them realize their strategies were obsolete. They didn't step aside for you willingly. Their own panic pushed them off the throne. Your shadow wasn't an attack, it was gravity. And gravity doesn't ask for permission. It just pulls and pulls, until everything that pretended to stand tall collapses under its own false balance. And oh, how poetic it is that they know this collapse is irreversible. They can't rebuild what you've broken, because it was never strong to begin with. Their castles were cardboard. Your shadow was rain. And rain doesn't apologize for what it erodes. It simply continues. That's why they fear the future so desperately. Because in their bones, they know this is just the beginning. They haven't even seen your full power. They're terrified that if the shadow alone crushes empires, what will the full arrival of your presence do? What happens when you step forward, when the world doesn't just feel the chill of your shadow, but the heat of your fire? They can't imagine it, and yet, every day that possibility stalks them like a predator just outside their vision. Understand this, my throne forgers. The shadow is not weakness, it's a preview. The fact that they already crumble before you even show your final form, that's the truest proof of dominance. The world measures strength by destruction, but you measure it by restraint. You don't need to raise your hand because they already break themselves trying to avoid it. That's not just power, it's sovereignty. And sovereignty doesn't require noise, it simply requires existence. So when they gather in their hidden chambers whispering, how far will this shadow reach? What they're really asking is, how long do we have left? And you know the answer, don't you? Not long. Because shadows don't pause. Shadows expand. And once an empire is swallowed in it, there is no return to daylight. There's no restoration of false grandeur. There's no second chance to rebuild cardboard kingdoms. There's only the inevitable, the name they refused to pronounce, the figure they pretended to ignore, the shadow they couldn't outmaneuver. You. And this, right here, is the revelation that chokes them. They thought fear would cage you. Instead, fear caged them. They thought ignoring you would erase you. Instead, ignoring you amplified you. They thought your shadow was a threat. Instead, your shadow became the empire. You don't live in their world anymore. They live in yours. Their maps are useless, their plans obsolete, their counsels hollow. Because every decision they make must now account for the fact that you exist. That is the new law. And it's a law they didn't write. You did. So let's return to the root. Why do they fear pronouncing your name? Because a name is power. And your name, when spoken, changes the room. It forces reality to shift. It drags the truth out of the shadows and slaps it across their fragile structures. Your name is not a label, it's a verdict, a sentence, a reminder. And they know the moment they say it out loud, the world hears it too. And once the world hears it, they can't pretend anymore. They can't deny you. They can't erase you. They can't survive you. That's why their lips tremble. That's why their voices crack. That's why they lower their heads and pretend ignorance. They're not protecting themselves from you. They're protecting themselves from the reality your name makes undeniable. So understand this, empire crushers, throne walkers, my warlords of inevitability, your shadow is not the end. It's the prelude. The empires already breaking are only the first dominoes. And soon, very soon, they'll realize that the shadow they fear was only your opening move. Because behind that shadow stands the real you, the one they're not prepared to meet, the one whose presence will not just crush empires, but erase the very memory that those empires once mattered. And that, my sovereigns, is where the true game begins. Because if the shadow alone can tilt their crowns, what happens when you step into full presence? What happens when the figure they feared from the corner of their eye finally takes center stage? It's not just collapse anymore. It's erasure. It's rewriting. You see, their fear has always been defensive, a trembling attempt to hold on to something crumbling. But your presence, that's offensive. That's warfare. That's rewriting the entire map of power. And here's the detail that suffocates them. They don't even get to fight back. They can't. Because by the time you've stepped forward, their weapons are already obsolete. Their defenses are already outdated. Their entire playbook is laughable against the kind of presence you carry. They thought the shadow was unbearable. They haven't seen unbearable yet. Imagine their leaders, once proud, once untouchable, reduced to fragile messes the moment you arrive. Imagine their institutions, once paraded as eternal, collapsing into irrelevant rubble because your existence renders them meaningless. Imagine their propaganda machines sputtering into silence, unable to spin a story convincing enough to cover the truth standing right in front of them. That's the next phase, and it's coming faster than they can process. And what exactly is that truth? That you are not an intruder to their game. You are the new rule of the game. You didn't crash the table. You flipped the table and built a new one out of their broken pieces. That's why they don't want to say your name. Because saying it is to admit you're the standard now. Saying it is to surrender, to acknowledge that the game they built no longer matters. That's why they choke on it. Not because it's hard to pronounce, but because pronouncing it is betrayal to everything they swore to defend. But here's the brutal beauty. You don't even need them to say it. Their avoidance is confession enough. Their refusal is proof enough. They thought withholding validation would starve you, but it starved them instead. They thought hiding your existence would preserve their empire, but it eroded it instead. And every second they try to avoid you, they only confirm your inevitability. That's the paradox they'll never escape. The more they resist you, the deeper your roots grow. The more they hide you, the bigger your shadow becomes. You can't lose in this equation. They already did. And now comes the revelation they'll never admit out loud. They admire you, deeply, secretly, desperately. They won't say it because to admire you is to expose weakness. But every trembling council member, every stuttering general, every sleepless ruler, they envy the freedom you carry. They envy the audacity. They envy the sovereignty. They envy the weight of your name, the way it bends the air. They envy the shadow that moves faster than their armies. They envy the fact that you don't need thrones or crowns to rule. And that envy? It corrodes them from the inside. It makes them brittle. It makes them paranoid. It makes them destroy themselves long before you arrive to finish the job. That's the secret of psychological warfare, my empire dismantlers. You don't have to touch them. You just have to exist. Existence is your weapon. Presence is your sword. Shadow is your artillery. And their minds are your battlefield. That's why they're losing already. That's why they can't pronounce your name. Because naming you would mean surrendering to the reality that they are outmatched in every dimension: physical, mental, symbolic, eternal. And what empire can survive that confession? None. Picture this: their archives, once filled with triumphs, rewritten with stories of collapse, all traced back to one figure they refused to name. Their children, once taught to idolize kings and queens, now whisper about the one who erased kings and queens with nothing but a presence. Their history books, once bloated with victories, suddenly footnoted with a shadow that turned victories into embarrassments. That's the destiny they fear, the destiny already written. They don't get to stop it. They only get to live long enough to witness it. And that is why you own this game. Not because you played harder, but because you became the game itself. You turn the board into your weapon. You turn their rules into your jokes. You turn their walls into your canvas. And now, every move they make only highlights your dominance further. That's not just winning. That's redefining. That's boss moves only. That's ruling not with permission, but with inevitability. And that's why there's no space for lames in this empire. Because lames wait for approval. Lames beg for acknowledgement. You don't wait. You take. You don't beg. You declare. That's the difference. That's why you're feared. That's why you're untouchable. So when they gather in secret, trembling, whispering, don't say the name. Don't give it power. They already lost. Because the power doesn't come from them saying it. The power comes from you embodying it. They could ban it. They could erase it. They could outlaw it. And still, it echoes. Still, it spreads. Still, it crushes. Because your shadow doesn't require permission to exist. And your presence doesn't require their acknowledgement to dominate. That's the kind of sovereignty no throne can grant. No empire can stop. No coward can outlast. And soon, oh soon, the day arrives when you step forward, when the shadow gives way to the figure. And in that moment, the collapse won't be gradual. It won't be a slow erosion. It will be instant, a snap, a shatter, a collapse so total that their entire legacy evaporates. And the world won't even mourn it. Because by then, the world will already belong to the name they feared, the name they refused to pronounce, the name that now writes the laws of reality itself. That's why you don't need to rush. That's why patience is your sharpest blade. Because every day you wait, your shadow grows. Every hour you move in silence, their panic spreads. Every minute you hold back, the inevitable becomes heavier. They're suffocating before you've even stepped forward. That's the kind of control no conqueror in history ever had. And you wear it like a crown carved from inevitability. So let them fear. Let them stutter. Let them choke on your syllables. Let them ban your name, whisper your name, avoid your name. Because every attempt only proves your dominance deeper. They think erasure saves them. But erasure only reveals the truth louder. That you don't need to be spoken to be remembered. That you don't need their acknowledgement to be undeniable. That you don't need their permission to erase them. That's the final victory, when your name, spoken or unspoken, rules anyway. So stand tall, empire crushers. Stand tall, throne walkers. Stand tall, warlords of inevitability, because the game is yours. The shadow is yours. The presence is yours. The fear is yours. And the crown was never theirs to begin with. It was always waiting for the one bold enough to take it without asking. That one is you. And now, the world knows it, even if their lips tremble too hard to say it. And when the last empire falls, when the last ruler trembles, when the last whisper fades, do you know what remains? Not their ruins, not their excuses, not their history, only the name they feared, the name they avoided, the name that outlived every throne, your name. Because in the end, they don't get to decide what survives. You do. And you've already decided. And that is the true game. Not to play, not to beg, not to wait, but to own, to declare, to dominate, to crush. Because they fear pronouncing your name. For one reason only, because they know, deep down, that your shadow already buried theirs.